What does wildfire smoke do to your brain, and what can you do about it? Well, today it is June the 9th, 2023, and for the last week, we've seen some of the worst wildfire smoke in recent history, specifically on the eastern seaboard of the United States. This is a result of wildfires burning in Canada, of which there are around 400 due to dry conditions and hot conditions. And if you're living on the eastern seaboard, New York, Pennsylvania, parts of obviously Canada, and even into the Midwest of the United States, you're experiencing what people on the west coast of the United States and the west coast of Canada have experienced basically every summer for the last few years, which is intense smoke that you can taste in your mouth, in your nose, can make it hard to breathe, and generally looks really scary. So obviously that's not ideal, but the real question I think we should be asking ourselves is maybe what does this do to our health and what can we be doing about it? And as it relates to how wildfire smoke can affect our bodies, there's definitely some really important research around what smoke does to the brain. There's also some important points about what we can do to mitigate these risks. So let's go ahead and jump right into this topic. How does wildfire smoke impact your brain and what you can do about it? I'm Dr. Austin Perlmutter. And just as a quick aside, if you're interested in these types of topics, research, science around brain health, and other forms of health optimization, make sure you're subscribed to this channel, to this podcast. Okay, so let's start with the basics. As we sit here in the first week of June, going into the second week of June of 2023, we've got a whole lot of people who are experiencing wildfire smoke. And this is nothing atypical. What we've seen is for the last years that wildfires have been an increasing problem in the United States and also around the world, and that more and more people are being exposed to these intense bouts of wildfire smoke. So, what is in wildfire smoke? Well, there are a number of different variables here. So, depending on what is burning, there can be different levels of things like heavy metals. Some smoke has higher levels of things like lead in it. But by and large, when we look at things that we're worried about as it relates to how air pollution and specifically smoke may impact our bodies and may impact our brains, we're worried about these tiny little particles called PM 2.5s. And these are 2.5 microns or smaller. So they're really, really small. Why that is a problem is because, unlike perhaps other things in the air, when we inhale these PM 2.5s, they can pass through our lungs and get into our bloodstream where they can wreak havoc on our overall health. We'll talk about some of the mechanisms in which that may happen. What we know about as it relates to overall health is that exposure to air pollution and these PM 2.5s seems to be a major risk factor for having lung and cardiovascular problems. So we're talking about respiratory issues, asthma exacerbations, and trouble breathing, cough, shortness of breath. We also know that from a cardiovascular perspective, that exposure to these PM 2.5s may increase the risk of developing cardiovascular complications. So those things seem like, at face value, maybe they're separate from what is happening in the brain. And maybe that's a good question. Why should people worry about air pollution and the connection to their brain health? But in the last several years, we have seen compelling research indicating that air pollution exposure may be one of the most important and very hidden, in that people don't often think about this, risk factors for brain diseases. What am I talking about here? Well, I'm talking about risk for developing dementia, including Alzheimer's disease, which is the most common form of dementia around the world. We now understand that people who are exposed to higher levels of air pollution are at a higher risk for developing Alzheimer's disease. And again, we'll talk about some of the mechanisms there. In the last few years, we've also seen a variety of studies published in top tier medical journals suggesting that exposure to air pollution appears to be an important risk factor for the development of depression. Again, this doesn't necessarily flow from the idea that these are tiny molecules that get into the bloodstream that damage the lungs, cardiovascular system, because here we're talking about brain health. So, how is it that these things may connect? Well, there are two major mechanisms that I think we should pay attention to as it relates to how air pollution, and smoke being a good example of that, may impact our brain function. Those two molecular mechanisms would be alterations in the immune system, specifically inflammation, and increases in oxidative stress. These are kind of the two major ideas as to how these PM 2.5s are negatively impacting our health by increasing inflammation and by increasing oxidative stress. Now, we've learned in the last 100 years, but especially in the last few years, that what happens in the body does impact the brain. It's not like you have an immune system down in your bloodstream and your immune system in your brain and they don't communicate whatsoever. We know that our brain does have an immune system and that that immune system is sensitive to what is happening in the rest of our body. Good example here would be the gut-brain connection. We know that what happens in the gut impacts the brain and vice versa. So the concept here is exposure to air pollution increases inflammation in the body. This inflammation may, through a variety of mechanisms, translate into problems for the brain, including brain inflammation, which is in and of itself a risk factor, higher risk for developing things like Alzheimer's disease and developing depression, among other mental health issues. So, the oxidative stress component of this, at a very basic level, is the idea that within our bodies, there is a balance between oxidation and reduction. And more or less, we want to kind of maintain that homeostasis. Sometimes we're exposed to excess oxidative stress and we can't counter it with antioxidants. So, that oxidative stress can damage our tissues, can lead to what some have described as an internal rusting of our organs, which is no good. And the thought is that these PM 2.5s increase oxidative stress in our bodies and therefore lead to this damage to tissues, which in and of itself may increase risk for inflammation. So let's put this all into context. We now have evidence that many people are being exposed to high levels of wildfire smoke. This is an increasingly important theme as we see changes in climate across the United States and across the planet, where we're having summers that are more conducive to these intense wildfire seasons. We know that these intense wildfire seasons lead to higher levels of exposure to wildfire smoke, and that wildfire smoke contains a number of dangerous chemicals, and especially these tiny little molecules that can get into our bodies and damage our health, including our brain health. So that's a lot, and it's a lot of maybe scary stuff. The good news is there are things that we can do about this. And the most basic thing that a person can do, and probably the most effective thing that a person can do to mitigate the effects of wildfire smoke on brain health, is simply to decrease exposure to that wildfire smoke. Now, that sounds straightforward, but often we will say, well, it's just a bit of smoke outside. It's not a big deal. When you go to your local government's website or to a weather website and it says the air quality outside is poor, it's usually talking about higher levels of these PM 2.5s. And recommendations will actually vary depending on a person's underlying medical conditions. We know that people with existing chronic diseases, especially lung and cardiovascular diseases, may be at higher risk of having complications if they're exposed to this PM 2.5, very small particulate matter that can lead to these problems in their bodies. But the recommendations usually will say something along the lines of people who are sensitive should avoid spending too much time outside, all the way up into saying nobody should go outside unless they have to. And here's a really important piece of this equation, which is that humans in general don't really associate health risks as big problems unless they are correlated with, unless we feel something at that time. So if you were to stub your toe, you would know that that was a problem and you would take steps to basically get off of that toe so that you wouldn't experience more pain. But with air pollution, it isn't as dramatic often, especially when it's at lower levels. So yes, if you go outside and it's really, really dense and you feel like you're having trouble breathing, you'll probably do something to get out of that situation. But oftentimes it's more subtle and we can't necessarily experience it. And we kind of just say, oh, I'm going to suck it up. Long term, that is the type of thing that may compound and lead to issues with our brain function. So the bottom line here is look at the local recommendations. And if they say that there's a lot of air pollution, especially these PM 2.5s in your nearby vicinity, try to limit your outdoor exposure and similarly close your windows. You don't want that air pollution getting in. When you are indoors, consider using a HEPA quality air filter that will basically filter out the majority of these tiny little molecules, these PM 2.5s. There is a huge difference in quality of different sizes of filters, different levels of MERV, but if you happen to have access to an indoor air filtration system, generally speaking, using those filters is going to be a good idea. And if you haven't already purchased one, getting one with HEPA filtration is a good plan. What about other things that you can do indoors? Well, something that very few people think about is that a lot of pollution is actually generated indoors. And by the laws of time spent, people actually probably get more exposure to air pollution inside their houses than outside their houses. So what you don't want to do is say, I'm not going outside because there's air pollution, and then generate a bunch of air pollution inside. And to that end, some of the things that you should pay attention to as it relates to indoor sources of air pollution are going to be incense and essential oil diffusers. Yes, I said it. Both of those things contribute to indoor air pollution. Cooking, if you're going to cook inside, do your best to get ventilation through something like a hood, because we know that indoor cooking can be one of the top sources of air pollution. And then cleaning. Cleaning is actually an important source of indoor air pollution. So not just vacuuming. Vacuuming can be a big issue, especially if you have a vacuum cleaner that puts out a lot of dust, but also just sweeping and the, generally speaking, chemicals that we use for indoor cleaning can all be bigger source of air pollution. So I'm not trying to say that you can never use those things, but if your goal is to decrease your exposure to air pollution because there's outdoor smoke, don't come inside and then make things worse by compounding the effects by bringing in a whole bunch of additional air pollutants inside. One other question that often comes up is the relative use of masks. So masks, obviously, people have their opinions on them over the last few years in the context of spreading viral illness. But as it relates to air pollution, it's really important to understand that the primary air pollutants, specifically that we worry about in wildfire smoke, are these PM 2.5s, which are really, really small. And to that end, doing something like using a surgical mask or a cloth mask, it's really not going to do much of anything. Even an N95, which we kind of consider the best of the best as it relates to things that we can be using each day to decrease exposure to things in our environment as it relates to bringing things in through our mouths and noses, unless it's a good fit, it may not be doing that much. So if you have facial hair like I do, you may actually find that the N95 doesn't fit as well as you've thought. So if you are going to use a mask as a way to mitigate your exposure to outdoor air pollution, specifically wildfire smoke, using a high quality N95 is probably your best bet. And beyond that, if you really want to be serious about it, you need to make sure that it is a good fit. That means finding the right size. And if you really want to go for it, it means also probably not having the facial hair connecting with the mask. So this is, again, this topic of how wildfire smoke impacts the brain. And there's a lot we still don't know about the exact mechanisms and the exact effects of it. But I think at this point, there is more than enough data to suggest that our exposure to smoke, to air pollution, and especially to these really concentrated sources of air pollution in the form of wildfire smoke, is doing our health no favors, and specifically appears to be a risk factor for brain issues. There's a lot of data suggesting now that air pollution is changing our brains, not just in the long term, but also in the short term, changing our patterns of decision making, making us potentially even more likely to commit crimes. Fascinating stuff. But beyond all that, the bottom line for each of us is we may not always be able to completely avoid wildfire smoke, depending on where we live and depending on our access to some of these resources, depending on our jobs. But there's always something that we can do to help lower our risk for too much exposure. So if you live somewhere that is exposed to wildfire smoke, consider trying to remain indoors, consider trying to use some of these indoor filtration strategies, consider not exposing yourself to additional and unnecessary sources of indoor air pollution. And if you're going to be outside, consider using a tightly fitting N95 mask. So that's all on this topic. If this is something that's of interest to you, leave me a comment, send me a message, and let me know. I'm always looking for new topics that are helpful to people to understand as it relates to the connection between their environment and their brain health. And this is just but one of many topics that has come up recently. So again, I'm Dr. Austin Perlmutter. If you'd like to continue to hear this type of content, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll talk to you next time.